Hello and welcome to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt, Senior Editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com. And we thought who better to join us here on Deprogrammed for the last show of the year than the NCF's very own Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, also a prolific broadcaster and royal historian. Rafe, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good to be on the programme. I've now got the NCF hat-trick.
Indeed.
My bucket list is complete. Good way to end the year.
Quite so, yes. Well, it was recently reported in the Times that as many as 100,000 marriages in Britain fall under the jurisdiction of Sharia councils. They quoted one woman anonymously as saying, "I feel like I have to pay a ransom to get out of my marriage." Female testimony being accorded less weight in most schools of Islamic jurisprudence, if not all of them, in fact, than a man's. Is it going too far to describe this as the emergence of a parallel justice system in the UK?
More than the emergence, I think it's now sort of almost, you could say, fully entrenched and embedded. Britain is now the leading country in the West for Sharia courts. No other country has seen the sort of rise in the number of marriages. And in fact, British Sharia experts are advising people in North America and Canada. So it is a growing problem. Most of the stuff now, thankfully, is limited to things like marriage, divorce, some financial products and so forth. But, it's a slippery end of the wedge because, of course, as we see elsewhere in the world, there's a much darker and more dangerous side to Sharia law. And it's only a question of time before we see sort of efforts made to expand the reach of Sharia law. I mean, it's women, it's funny that, you never get feminists talking about any of this, unsurprisingly. All it takes for a man to divorce his wife under Sharia law is to say divorce 3 times. I'm sure many Englishmen wished it were that easy for them as well. But for a woman, they have to go before the Sharia courts, which are run entirely by men. And these men, quite often, their goal is to try to reconcile the relationship, even if they're in a severely abusive relationship. And the Sharia law believes that husband can't rape his wife. And they basically misinterpret parts of the Hadith to enforce man's dominance over women. And so the fact that this is allowed to exist in a allegedly equal society that we have today, should be extremely worrying to feminists, and yet they remain completely silent on the issue. And we now know that many of these judges on Sharia, we should explain what Sharia law is. So Sharia law was defined by Dr. Moni Siddiqui as jurisprudence based upon the opinions of jurists in the era of classical Islam, which is from the 7th to the 12th century. So it would be the same as if we were still applying laws from the Normans and the Plantagenets in this country today. I don't know what witchcraft position's taken in Sharia law, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's something along those lines. And many of these experts, these religious scholars who sit on these Sharia councils, are extremists. Many of them belong to the Deobandi faith. We have to remember that 40% of the mosques in Britain are run by Deobandis, which was the progenitor of the Taliban. And in fact, half of Muslim chaplains in prisons are Deobandi followers, which of course is leading to the increased radicalization within our prisons. Nothing has been done by the Tories, and nothing will be done by Labour to combat the spread of this extremism. And so many of these scholars went to Afghanistan, for example, when the Taliban came back to power, and these are the people who are now deciding the fate of women in this country.
Do you see it spreading into criminal law as well as civil law, the more that Muslims, I suppose, demographically expand in this country and acquire critical mass we're already seeing the beginnings of this. Of course, there are about 5 effectively Islamist MPs in the moment who see politics exclusively through their own little ethno-religious struggles. Do you see this expanding the more Islam expands in this country as a demographic phenomenon?
I think it's inevitable that we're going to see increased calls for Sharia law to be expanded to the realm of criminal law. I think that might be the point at which the government decides to take action, because the penalties under criminal law for Sharia are simply so extreme, I mean, let alone, the more minor things, at the most severe end, if you commit apostasy, you're put to death. If you are homosexual, you're put to death. Stoning for adultery. But worryingly of all, of course, is that the children, or Muslim children, are the most radical element in Muslim society, and they're only getting larger, and they hold far more radical beliefs than their parents or grandparents. So a full 1/3 of Muslim youth believe that, aged 18 to 24, believe you should be put to death for apostasy. Another third more than a third want Sharia law in this country. It's higher than the broader population. So it's inevitable that you're going to see more pushes towards that level. I think, any sensible government would, criminalize anyone who has a Sharia law marriage if they don't also have it civically contracted, because one of the great issues is that many of these Sharia law marriages aren't followed up with any sort of civic marriage. And so that makes it impossible for the courts to get involved in divorces and so forth. So if you criminalize anyone who doesn't have a civic marriage allied with Sharia law, that's one way to do it. You could actually also use anti-discrimination laws then to protect women who are being treated unfairly in that sort of a scenario as well. But I just think more blatantly outright, we should take a firm stance and simply ban Sharia law completely and pass a law saying that it is not permissible in this country to have we say 2-tier justice, we have 3-tier justice with Sharia law.
Yeah, I believe that was actually in Reform's contract with the people, as well as trying to ban halal slaughter and cousin marriage, which is a very strong stance. I do fear, though, Rafe, that you're optimistic that as soon as this becomes an overt rather than a just bubbling under the surface standard of justice, that the government will step in. Because we do know, as I've been trying to bring attention to throughout the year, there is a 700-strong Islamic network at the Home Office who were suspended because of suspected support for Hamas, and then their activities kicked back into overdrive in September under outspoken feminist Home Office ministers Yvette Cooper and Jess Phillips, who had Emily Atack on a video the other day talking about misogyny. Zero mention of this kind of phenomenon, despite the growth of Islamic sectarianism in politics and the growth of the Islamic population, with Muhammad now being the most popular baby name. And another reason why they probably won't take action on this, as they won't with immigration more broadly, is if you're saying that it's being exported, this expertise in Islamic law around the world now, with Britain becoming the number one for Sharia courts, then they're not going to kill off a veritable British cottage industry. So we haven't exactly got much left. And the thing that made me indicate that was the Times reached out to the government as to whether or not they had a comment on these 100,000 marriages, and they sent out a very mealy-mouthed statement which ended with, in our manifesto, we are increasing support for couples who live together but are not actually married. And it's like, this is just one among many living arrangements which is acceptable in modern Britain, is it? Brilliant.
Well, let me clarify. I don't expect the government to take any action on that whatsoever. What I'm talking about is when it goes into the area of criminal law. So family law, they're not going to get involved there and see advice on wills, for example. So you have Muslim Sharia wills, which mean that their daughters get half of what the sons get, and the wives get barely anything at all. And that is outside the purview of the courts, and yet we won't see the government doing it. What I'm saying, though, is I think, given how harsh the penalties are under Sharia law, I think that would be a point at which the courts, the government may well get involved. And there are other ways to tackle this as well. For example, the government could easily state that if you are arriving in this country and you are in a polygamous relationship, you have more than one wife, you will not get you'll not be successful in the application. You will never get permanent residency. You will never get citizenship. There are ways that you can enforce that for those who are coming here.
Yes. I think you're right. What many people call anarcho-tyranny, the idea that the state often behaves in a very sort of enthusiastic social engineering fashion when dealing with certain groups that aren't accredited, and when dealing with certain groups that are accredited, usually as victim groups. And this would conclude, given that Muslims in this country, despite being globally a massive phenomenon, pose as a cringing minority, they behave in a very anarchistic fashion with those groups. So that you've got this weird sort of mix of anarcho-tyranny that goes on in Britain at the moment. The dynamics of anarcho-tyranny in Britain are not so far gone that when a Muslim, say, like Salman Abedi, blows up, well, he obviously killed himself in the course of doing that, but let's say that he hadn't, let's say that he'd just gone on a knife attack, they're obviously going to arrest him. Their narco-tyranny is not so far gone that they literally turn a complete blind eye to that. And I suspect a similar thing would be the case if people really were starting to, wanting to, have sort of criminal Sharia jurisdictions in places like Birmingham, in places like Leicester, cutting off hands. The appetite, that would trigger Westminster sensibilities enough, I think, to force them to take action.
Mind you, now that you put it that way, actually, it might help to lower the crime rate in the country, actually, if we allowed Sharia law penalties. I know for a long time we need to be more like Singapore and bring in judicial canings to make the society, to make Britain again.
You can turn to the Bible for that justification, actually. You don't need to resort to the hadiths.
But it's interesting, actually, because, when MPs and others have spoken about regulating in some manner Sharia law, the government's response has been, we're not going to get involved because if we start to regulate it, that means we have de facto recognized it as a legitimate legal system, and so it's a perverse thing. We're not going to do anything about it because that way we'll recognize it. I can see you beating your wife, but I'm not going to do anything to stop it happening. But I think there's a broader issue which is more severe, I think, than the presence of Sharia courts or Sharia councils, and that's the subtle ways that you have what I would call social Sharia compliance, whereby you get this increased pressure by people perhaps who are quite moderate Muslims, but they feel compelled through shame or indeed the risk of discrimination and ostracization from their community to now wear the veil or to adopt not drink alcohol or to basically conduct themselves in an appropriate Muslim manner, and they don't want to be like that, but there's this growing pressure on them from the community,
and perhaps also not to report certain things that they otherwise would report because of those peer pressures as well. So there's a sense in which you have de facto Sharia jurisdictions before you have de jure Sharia jurisdictions, whether considered civilly or whether considered in a criminal fashion.
And it's not just, of course, the Muslims who are affected by this. You had infamously, the most famous one was Muslim Patrol, the band of Muslim, Islamists, I'd call them, because they are extremists, who were patrolling around the East End of London. They were attacking Muslim off-licenses, news agents who were selling alcohol. Yeah. They were condemning prostitutes on the street. Any woman who was immodestly dressed, they would verbally assault. Gay men, they were telling to get out of the area, using every slur imaginable. They were even putting stickers up with two men holding hands and a line through it. Saying this is a. So that's where it's beginning to infringe upon the rest of society, and also in terms of the corporate world. So I don't know how many people realize this, but for 10 years now, it's been impossible to get bacon or pork products at a Subway.
Yeah.
So you only get turkey rashers and so forth, but you go to Subway in America, they provide you with pork products. And yet here, deliberately to kowtow to the Muslim lobby, they have banned pork products, which, contrast that to Denmark, of course, where they insisted you have bacon and sausages on all school dinners, made available and so forth. Again, it's the weakness of Britain. It's our unwillingness to robustly promote and robustly defend British culture, British values, and British heritage that is allowing all of this.
You want to come in, Connor? Oh no, I thought I saw you twitching and. Yes, this phenomenon expresses itself in all sorts of ways, and it really does give the lie to the schizophrenic conversation that we're constantly having with ourselves about how, on the one hand, we encourage people who come here. The part of the whole part of the joy of modern Britain is that you can, cultivate your own values. You can practice your own culture in your own milieu while still being a solid, upstanding citizen of a multicultural republic, of a multicultural country. Whereas in practice, this very heavily conditions the way that the state operates with different communities, and it's not just Muslims. I mean, we saw this. I think it was it the Gypsy community in Hare Hills, which clearly felt a sufficient level of sort of clannishness and in-group solidarity that it didn't want the laws of this nation, the child protection laws of this nation, being applied in a disinterested and impartial fashion, regardless of community interests. And this happens all of the time, and the police have completely absorbed this sense. I mean, I think the one constable in particular who said we've consulted with community elders and community leaders, and we've asked them how they think they should be policed on this matter. They almost talk about these communities as nations within a nation and talk about themselves as diplomats who are trying to, engage in a certain amount of give and take rather than just simply enforcing the law without fear or favor. I only see this getting worse. What I'm trying to say is that the Sharia, the legal aspect of this, is just one among several. There are so many others which are significant and point in a very miserable direction for this country.
Yeah, we're transitioning from being a United Kingdom into a United Nations, a descent into ethno-nationalist silos. But of course, don't worry, because diversity is our great respect. So, take solace in that when you have your eggnog this Christmas. And of course, but the thing is, you get these self-appointed community leaders and infamous characters who, of course, have no authority in the sense that they aren't actually appointed by the populace. They just simply are some of the few people who can speak English. It's usually the only requirement to be a community leader in these communities. And it's only going to get worse. And of course, we all know from the evidence that, for example, to go back to Islam on this, segregated Muslims are twice as likely to be extremists as those who are actually more integrated within society. And these segregated communities act like petri dishes for the cultivation of abhorrent practices which are completely alien in our society. And that's why you're seeing Britain as now the leading country for acid attacks. That's why you see the rise in honor killings, in forced marriages, in child marriages, and of course it doesn't just apply to Muslims. That maybe the Metropolitan Police now have a witchcraft department where they are training their officers to detect witchcraft practices connected to Africans coming here from Africa, as well as some people coming from Latin America, and to how to detect child abuse related to witchcraft rituals. And of course, there have been people who've been killed over this in the past, and this is going on. When one of the reasons I loved history was learning about the Tudors. And having people being beheaded and their heads on spikes and witches being burned. I didn't think we'd be seeing beheadings and witches in the 21st century Britain.
Yeah, we thought they'd peaked in the 17th century. I gather.
Well, Mind did a training course for NHS clinicians about Islamic witchcraft.
What's Mind, sorry?
Mind was the mental health charity that obviously receives government funding. So they thought that was a great use of taxpayer cash. Again, diversity being our strength.
Yeah.
But on that topic, the sort of government endorsement of two-tier policing, we saw in recent weeks Sarah Khan, the former extremism advisor that was working at the Home Office, her sister ran RIKU, which I've spoken about with Peter before, which is the propaganda department of the Home Office, which anytime someone takes the Quran a bit too seriously and straps some C4 to themselves, tells the grieving parents don't look back in anger. She released a report in conjunction with Hope Not Hate, and it focused completely myopically on the phantom threat of the far right, with definitions provided by Hope Not Hate and the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which said we need to kill Musk's ex. Meanwhile, a week following that, we hear about these 100,000 marriages overseen by Sharia courts. We've got members of parliament now standing up on a pro-Gaza ticket, run by Hamas, a proscribed terrorist group in this country, advocating on behalf of cousin marriage, which only further seeks to entrench that clannishness. And again, a complete blind eye is turned by the state-funded experts in hate and extremism and the government themselves. And so you've got this tacit admission that a separate tier of justice applies to these communities with community leaders that the government themselves feel the need to liaise with. I think back to the example where the schoolboy in Yorkshire dropped a Quran
scuffed a Quran,
because he lost a bet in Call of Duty, and there was a struggle session set up with cameras pointed at the mother
who was
in
wearing
the
a
local
veil.
mosque, aided and abetted by the local police, and then he, the kid, gets a non-crime hate incident for his trouble that will plague him for the rest of his life. Or during the summer protests and riots following the Southport massacre, which, as much as we say Sharia courts will not be able to cover up stabbings, there is certainly reporting restrictions still around that. It's not even raised questions about it. But during that, you had all the, let's say, English people that were raising their concerns, either in a reprehensible, violent way or a peaceful way, like Peter Lynch, who's now died in prison. They were treated with the iron glove of the law. Meanwhile, you've got community cohesion officers in blue luminous vests going, "Oh, sorry, lads, can you go and put your bricks and bats in the local mosque?" They're not telling Tom, Dick, and Harry to stick their cameras and the like in the local Wetherspoons, are they? And to de-escalate tensions. Again, I know I'm going on, but there is a clear lifting of the veil on the two-tier police system, so to speak.
Yeah. And this is precisely the same phenomenon. I mean, this is just an extension of the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, the industrial scale rape of English and Sikh and other children in the north of England, which still continues today, despite everyone treats this as if it was a past incident. And of course, then, as with all these things you're talking about, is because our institutions are, they're petrified by political correctness and they won't do anything. And so they are willingly sacrificing our young girls. They're putting people in prison, all in order to save community tensions. And I'm sorry, it is, what on the scales, I think, that the lives of people who've been ruined or indeed by this stuff certainly outweigh community tensions.
Well, 2 Yorkshire policemen have been arrested just in recent days by Operation Stovewood on suspicion of their sexual abuse in connection in the 90s with these grooming gangs. So they're still making arrests, they're still making hundreds of years of prison sentences doled out to perpetrators in Rotherham. And again, other than reposting the Crown Prosecution Service announcement on the BBC website, this isn't headline story. Greg Wallace, headline story. Me interviewing Liz Truss, gets a week of coverage on Sky News. Industrial scale rape of white British girls by imported Islamists. Nothing to see here.
Precisely. And then you have Clive Myrie and the BBC Newsreader and others gleefully promoting the article saying that GB News accounts for half of all Muslim stories, as if because no one else ever. Yeah, I'm just as if condemning them for being Islamophobic. Congratulations to GB News for having the balls to actually cover the stories.
Yes.
That the mainstream media won't cover. To give so much attention to Greg Wallace, for minor incidents, and yet to completely ignore, the industrial scale rape of a vast segment of this country, let alone the horrors meted out to Pakistani women and Bangladeshi women through honor killings and forced marriage and child marriages. Let alone, let's talk about, the whole thing with cousin marriages, the fact that there are so many children born here with birth defects, and not turning an eye on that and waiting till an MP speaks about it. So much for all these great investigative reporters at Channel 4 and on Newsnight and Panorama and so forth. It just sort of stinks to high heaven.
Yes, and I was just going to say 2 things as well before, because we will move on to cousin marriage. And I'd also like to ask you a little bit about why you think that the Christian churches in this country haven't been a little bit more solid in defending the quintessentially Christian understanding of law, as opposed to tolerating these sorts of parallel branches that are sprouting up across our green and pleasant land. But it's hilarious. It goes back to the doublespeak again. Diversity on the one hand is our greatest strength, yet if you enforce the law without fear or favor and ignore people's certain community interests, you will inflame dormant tensions. Well, if diversity was such a strength, then we wouldn't be constantly on a knife edge, and we wouldn't constantly be in fear of whether enforcing the law without fear or favor would lead to riots, would lead to protests, would lead to hills burning down, all these sorts of things. So again, it's testament to the doublespeak. Also on GB News in particular, the person who's probably done the best work in this country, certainly of mine and Connor's generation. Of course, many people will want to point to what Tommy Robinson has done, and others would want to point to what Andrew Norfolk at the Times has done, shining a spotlight on the grooming gangs. But Charlie Peters has done excellent work. And one of the things that he has pointed to in particular is that because there is such a strong sense of religious solidarity and ethnic clannishness in these kinds of neighborhoods, when some Pakistani ringleaders of a grooming gang are banged up and do go to prison, once they're out and once they've served their time, they slot back seamlessly into their little community.
When he was reporting on one of the trials, the daughter of one of the perpetrators who was sent down for many years shouted out from the dock, "I love you, Dad," during the sentencing after she knew what her dad had done. And the families tried to start a fight with one of the women that gave a witness statement after being raped as a child.
When you have an individual white paedophile in Britain, which does happen, these people instantly become pariahs overnight. There's no prospect in hell of them being welcomed back seamlessly into their community. So that begs the question: what is going unreported in these petri dishes that you talk about, Rafe?
Well, and we need to take a page out of Denmark's book on this, because many of these people we're talking about live in social housing, for example, and are on benefits and so forth. Now, the Danes have a policy of trying to break up and destroy and clean up some of its worst ghettos. And one of the ways it does this is by firstly ensuring that no more than 40% of any area can be ethnic minorities. Imagine trying to enforce that in this country, but
It helps you start earlier rather than waiting to get this back.
Priority is given to for social housing is given to people who are in education or in employment. But if you commit a crime, not only are you evicted, your entire family is evicted. And that seems to me to be a fantastic way to try to clean up an area in these ghettos and so forth. But also, that's a very good form of punishment as well.
Yes. Well, very quickly, former Archbishop Rowan Williams made some headlines, I believe, in around 2008, 2009, because he said that we should accommodate the growth of Sharia in this country at a de jure level, not at the kind of social Sharia that you're talking about, at a kind of de jure level. And I must say, I do like Archbishop William, the former Archbishop Rowan Williams on theology. I think he's a very interesting and cultivated man, and well worth reading on sort of natural theology and all those sorts of things. But this struck me a great deal because, of course, the Christian understanding of law is quintessentially different from the Muslim understanding of law. Like in Islam, law is about divine commands, and of course there is a precedent and there's jurisprudence as well, but it all has to flow seamlessly from the Quran, the Hadith, the text of Islam, the life of the Prophet Muhammad. It's sort of very rigid, and unlike Christian law, there's this understanding that render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. There is a separation between the spiritual realm, the temporal realm, the sacred and the secular. There is an understanding that yes, law should be informed by certain Christian ethical principles. It shouldn't be completely amoral, but what secularism properly means for Christians is that law needs to be able to adjust to changing human realities, and there does need to be an exercise of natural reason in formulating what makes its way into law. And lots of Muslim people in the past, well, not lots, but there was an 18th century Muslim historian and theologian called Ibrahim Mutafarrika, who praised the West for having this concept of law, which made it much more creative and much less stultifying than the Muslim world, which was based on this kind of divine command theory of law. And yet we are importing everything that Ibrahim Mutafarrika lamented in the 18th century into our midst. Now, why do you think that Christians, given that we have such a rich conception of law, have not defended it? And Rowan Williams is a standard example, but the Christians in actively supporting it. But I would say that the Church of England, the Catholic Church, other churches have been very, very quiet about this, and you would have thought they would be prouder of their honourable tradition of law.
You would have thought so, but unfortunately, we all know. I mean, it's not surprising at all because the church has been captured as all of our other institutions have been captured. I mean, it needs to be a very brave Anglican cleric to have a swipe at another faith, because there's simply everything now is about interfaith dialogue, and you stay in your lane is the 11th commandment, it seems, for many clerics and people in the clergy. I'm sure if he spoke to some evangelical ministers, they would be a bit more forthright on all of this. But I don't think there's no theological reason why they're not getting involved. It's just because, again, they're petrified by political correctness.
Well, I might be able to provide a theological reason, and that might be that the passage from Paul, I think it might be Romans, where he says that you need to obey authorities because, after all, there's a reason that they're carrying the sword. I mean, look at the level of Muslim interest being entrenched at the highest offices of government. Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood, for example, or, as I've already mentioned, the Khan sisters who helped run Raiko. It really does look like the most muscular forms of Islam are the ones holding the government sword at the moment. And so if it looks like the power is flowing in that direction, then appeasement at home, particularly for the more liberal-minded, lily-livered types in the church, the less muscular Christians, this might be the strategy they think is the most sensible. I mean, I remember speaking to an outgoing priest at my parish who I vehemently disagreed with, who thought that flying the pride flag at World Youth Day was acceptable, and that having a day dedicated to Racial Justice Sunday and equity was a sensible idea. And he once said, I like what Baroness Saida Vorsi's been doing on religious freedom. Sorry, it's not religious freedom. You don't understand. This is advancing the interests of Islam at the expense of your incommensurate Christian worldview. And I think there's lots of people like Bishop Rowan Williams who just don't get how existential this is. And they think, like the Labour government, their religion is just one among many different lifestyles that will occupy purely the private sphere, when it seems lots of Muslims are not interested in being purely private observers.
And, of course, that the church is decidedly passive now in a way that it wasn't before. So, the whole notion of proselytizing for the faith, of trying to convert people to the message, that's now frowned upon. I had lunch yesterday with someone who's an Indian chap who's becoming an Anglican minister, is going to be ordained, and he saw it as his mission to spread the word. And of course, but that's the same thing. So any sort of robust defense of Catholic teaching, Catholic theology, trying to, doing everything you're saying, that just runs anathema to the current zeitgeist, which essentially is we have to, take a back seat to all this, because we've been too aggressive in the past.
Well, as G.K. Chesterton said, I want a church that moves the world, not one that moves with the world. And so hopefully, Christians can pluck up more courage, because they have, as I say, I won't go on about it again, I promise, but they have an honourable tradition from which they can draw in being muscular, as Connor is saying. What do you think? Connor mentioned that in their contract with the People Reform actually. I wasn't aware of this. Go on. What did they have it in there?
They had that they were going to ban halal slaughter. They were going to ban cousin marriage. They were going to automatically deport any perpetrators of the grooming gang. They were going to ban Sharia law.
So this is some pretty strong stuff. Of course, Farage recently disappointed some people on our side of things by seeming to want to appease the demographic expansion of Islam in this country. And he was very vocal about this in an interview with Winston Marshall, where he said, we will end up losing it unless we make these sorts of overtures, unless we extend the olive branch in this way. Do you see reform taking up the mantle here? Are you encouraged by certain noises that have been made?
Well, you're encouraged one day and you're discouraged the next day. And the problem here, of course, is that we don't have a real policy platform for reform on these sorts of topics, on immigration. He said on Winston Marshall's show that mass deportation was impossible. Then you had Trump elected after that, and you had the borders are Homeland saying we're going to embark on the biggest program of mass deportations in American history. And in the next podcast Nigel did, he was suddenly a bit more open to the idea of mass deportations. And that's not the way you can run a party, by having these contradictory statements. You can't run it by sound bites. We need to get, now that they've got 5 MPs in Parliament, we need to see clear policy agendas coming forward. I understand that will be coming in the new year, but we will learn more about this, and so need to wait and see about it all. I mean, it has to be said, of course, we're talking about Sharia law and so forth, and Nigel says you need to accommodate moderate Muslims.
He doesn't necessarily mean that. Yeah.
100,000. There are 100,000 marriages under Sharia law, but there are 3.9 million Muslims.
Yes, and so so in other words, you're saying that he has plausibility to claim that these are separate points. Yeah.
There are 32%, I think, of the last poll said that they wanted Sharia law in the country. I think that's an understatement, because they probably weren't speaking to people who couldn't speak English. But
52% said they wanted laws against drawing the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah,
that is a majority.
And also 62% of a previous poll wanted to restrict free speech if it affected.
Yes.
Yeah,
and it's also,
in terms of Sharia law, in terms of Sharia law, it's only about a third.
But can I just say, sorry, just very quickly, Ray, but as you say, and I think it's very important to underline the fact that Farage's point was future directed. He was talking about 2050, where are we going to be demographically in those terms? And as you yourself were saying earlier, the demographic momentum within Muslims living in Britain is on the side of Sharia law becoming more popular, because the younger are more in favour of it. So Farage may have plausible deniability of a kind in 2025, whether that will be the case in 2050.
They agree entirely. And we have to remember, of course, and I think you had one of your, you had this demographer on here who made this.
Paul Morland.
That most ethnic communities, when they arrive in this country, very soon their birth rates fall down to the English level. Unless you're Muslims. Muslims are producing more children. So, this is going to become a phenomenon much faster than we think, where they become more dominant. Professor David Coleman in 2010 said by 2066, the white British would be a minority in this country. But that was based upon immigration figures that are half of all the currently injured. So by my rough calculation, that means by some point in the 2050s, white British will become a minority. And then, of course, you get to the point, how can you expect these communities to assimilate into a culture where the indigenous population is itself an ethnic minority?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is that there need to be, there needs to be the living heritage of an existent people concretely available, infused into everything on the ground for individual immigrants coming here to assimilate. Otherwise, you're just you can't just come up with a kind of platonic set of British values and program people into them in any kind of abstract sense. Well, listen, go on.
But as we've said so many times on this channel and elsewhere, and I'm sure on your show, the whole point is there is no incentive to integrate.
Of course.
If you have your Sharia courts,
Yes.
if you have your ghettos, you can, people's daily lives pass with little to no interaction with wider society. And then again, what incentive is there for people to buy into Britain when all the messaging they're getting from schools, from universities, from museums, on television, from the government, is that Britain is a racist country, and it's an oppressor, and that that everything, all the evil in the world, can be traced back to Britain and the West in some capacity. So who can blame a young Muslim boy for cleaving more to the masculine, well-defined culture of his father in that context? Because again, this is all about confidence and assertiveness and self-belief. And when the West had that, we were indomitable and unbeatable. And of course, now the momentum is with other communities who have all of those same qualities. And that's what Russia and China are doing so successfully as well. We need to actually learn from that.
Well, listen, Rafe, you and I once spoke privately about Professor Joseph Heinrich's theory that it was in fact the outlawing of cousin marriage by the Catholic Church which made the West, in large part, unique, prosperous, individualistic in the good sense. We're going to talk about that a little bit afterwards for our member section. So if they want to get that, make sure to sign up. But for now, for this open part of the program, thank you for joining me. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so. Sign up if you want to catch our further discussion on the Deprogrammed Extra member section. And we shall see you on the next one. Happy Christmas.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.